Hello and welcome to week 2 of the BYFI virtual seminar Beyond Tikkun Olam. Today we're going to be talking about Jews and the labor movement, and particularly we're going to be looking at why Jews were so heavily involved in the labor movement, how Jews helped shape the movement, and how labor activism helped create or serve as new forms of secular American Jewish practice. And we'll be talking about some of this today and some of it in our discussion section later in the week. The story that we're going to be focusing on today, I want to say, is an urban story and an immigrant story. I feel like we've been spending a lot of time in the immigrant period, but I promise we will move on from that. But today we're going to be located still there. And by 1914, in a place like New York, for example, there were about 1.5 million Jews living there. The majority were working class and poor. Jews in New York City made up about 28% of the population. And most of those people had some personal experience of class conflict. Almost every person had been on a picket line or part of a labor parade or labor protest of some sort, or had a family member who had. There was also a very high concentration of Jews in the garment industry, not only in New York, but in other urban centers throughout the U.S. This was one of the leading industries. And this gave the Jewish labor movement a really strong base and a location for power and influence. This was complemented by a large and enthusiastic community of radical intellectuals who were, in some cases, organizers, lecturers, journalists, educators, poets, and writers. And there was a youth culture in the immigrant community that helped to give energy that fueled the focus on activism. Young people in cities enjoyed considerable personal freedom. There were fewer communal bodies in this immigrant period to punish deviant behavior. And immigrant children in particular were less subject to parental controls. And many young people spent many hours, most of their hours, working, which meant that they were not at home and they were not under the influence of their parents. During this period, there was also the attraction of the socialist and labor activist communities, which really spoke to the needs of the people, particularly around economic survival and around adaptation to America, in contrast to the more traditional Jewish communal leaders like rabbis who were focused on issues around assimilation and retaining religious observance. So that can also give a sense of why this movement was particularly attractive in this period and such a central piece of the Jewish experience. I want to make clear that when we're talking about the Jewish labor movement in this period, there are different kinds of organizations. There are unions that are not specifically Jewish by definition, but were in practicality mostly Jewish and therefore felt culturally Jewish. Things like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, where people would have spoken Yiddish with one another just by virtue of there being so many Jews, would have eaten similar foods, had the same kind of cultural language. There were other labor organizations that were Jewish by design and meant specifically for Jews. Initially, these were founded almost in a kind of opportunistic way. The idea was that if you want to organize and educate immigrant Jews to be labor activists, then you should do so in Yiddish and using Jewish cultural language because it was a way of reaching people where they were. Not because the organizers of these groups believed necessarily ideologically in the need for a separate Jewish movement. Over time, however, Jewish activists ended up building a very distinct Jewish labor movement and a new radical Yiddish culture that chose to define itself in these terms and really valued this distinctive culture. Part of the reason why Jews were able to have such an impact on the American labor movement is because they were very much present among the leadership as well as among the rank and file of the American labor movement, particularly in certain industries like the garment industry that I mentioned already. Many of these labor leaders were actually activists before they even came to the U.S. So I'm thinking, for example, of David Dubinski, who was a leader of the ILGWU for many years. He began his life as an activist in Poland, where he was an activist in the Bakers Union in Lodz by the time he was an early teen. He was arrested for his activity and sentenced to exile in Siberia. He managed to escape on his way and emigrated to New York City, where he got a job as a cutter, which is one of the more skilled jobs in the garment industry. And from there, he joined the ILGWU and quickly moved up the ranks of leadership there. I'm also thinking of someone like Sidney Hillman, who was born in Lithuania in 1897 to a traditional family and actually began rabbinic studies, but left those for revolutionary politics, which called to him, and he joined the Bund, the Socialist Union of Jewish Workers. He also was arrested and imprisoned, which only kind of furthered his revolutionary education. After the failed Russian Revolution of 1905, he immigrated to England and then to the U.S., where he got a job in Chicago also as a cutter, as an apprentice cutter. And in 1910, he joined a citywide garment strike and quickly became a union leader and ultimately a union professional. He married someone he met on that strike, Bessie Abramowitz. She was one of its leaders, and he became the president of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, which was a new union that was founded in 1914. So there were certainly kind of important labor leader heads who were Jewish and who helped give the movement and an infusion of Jewish immigrant culture. But I also really want to talk about several women who were important Jewish labor leaders. And one of the really great contributions of Jews to the labor movement, I believe, was the introduction of women organizers and union members and a transformation of American labor culture to include women. So in early 20th century northern cities where most Jewish immigrants lived, it was really only the exceptional unmarried woman who did not operate a sewing machine in a garment factory at some point in her young adult life. These women worked for very long hours at very low wages. The conditions were unsanitary, often unsafe. Women also faced the added issue of sexual harassment and assault on the job. And Jewish women didn't really find an easy place for them in the labor movement. Male leaders were not particularly interested in women's involvement because they perceived women workers as not committed for the long term. Most of these women would work for several years until they got married, and then they would not work outside of the home for wages again. And then the women's movement, who were interested in supporting women workers, they themselves were not workers. They were from middle and upper middle class backgrounds. And they could also sometimes be anti-Semitic. So there wasn't like a comfortable place where Jewish women fit. Even among their fellow women workers, they were often divided along ethnic divisions. And shop floor owners tried to play that up. They would often try to seat women who spoke different languages next to each other to avoid having them develop relationships, although that mostly failed. I'm going to talk particularly about two events that shaped many Jewish women's lifelong activism and that were turning points in the history of the labor movement and in Jewish women's history as well, the 1909 garment industry strike called the Uprising of the 20,000 and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911. So a few of the leaders that I want to talk about who were important in this period and in kind of transforming the American labor movement to include women and Jewish women in particular, the first I want to mention is Pauline Newman, who was born in Lithuania around 1890. She immigrated to the U.S. in 1901 as a young child, and she really spent her life in the union movement. She began working at age 9 in a hairbrush factory and then moved on to making shirtwaists and worked for a time at the Triangle Factory. She really built her reputation first as a leader in the 1907 rent strike when she was 16. She had spent 5 years working in the factory and had figured out how to combine the kind of shop floor organizing that she saw in factories and apply that to women's neighborhood networks. And this created the best organized and largest rent strike New York had ever seen, and it really set the stage for the campaign for rent control in New York City. Newman spent pretty much her whole career with the ILGWU. She worked there for more than 70 years. And from the late 20s on, she worked for and helped shape new government agencies that worked for improved labor conditions for women workers. She consulted frequently with New York State on minimum wage and safety codes for women workers, and she and her partner, Frida Miller, with whom she raised a child, were part of the Roosevelt's inner circle of reformers and had a big influence there. One of Pauline Newman's friends and colleagues was Roe Schneiderman. She was born in Poland in 1882 and immigrated with her family in 1890. Her father died soon after when she was 10 years old, leaving a pregnant wife and 3 young kids. And the mother struggled to support the family with many jobs, but ultimately when she was 13, Rose had to leave school and she took her first job at a department store. Her mother very much wanted her to work in a department store rather than a factory since it was more respectable. But Rose figured out that this was not the best way to earn a living and that she could actually make better money in a factory, and she became a cap maker at age 16. And that was where she began her union activism. She noticed pretty quickly that the highest paid jobs in the factory were reserved for men. And when she asked about that, her colleagues explained that men belonged to the union and therefore had been able to improve their conditions by working collectively. So she went to the United Cloth, Hat, and Cap Makers Union to request union recognition for a fledgling group of trimmers and lining makers. Those were women's jobs, which were not paid well. The official pretty much laughed at her and thought it was ridiculous that she'd be able to organize women, and so said, fine, if you can gather 25 signatures, you can have your local. And she was able to do that within a few days, and she was elected the secretary. And when the Cap Makers Union called for a general strike in 1905, Schneiderman was the only woman leader in the union, and so she was able to get a lot of work done with the women and get a lot of press and lasting respect from male cap makers, which also brought her to the attention of the Women's Trade Union League. This was an organization of progressive middle and upper class women reformers who were interested in helping working women organize. And Schneiderman began working with them, became one of their organizers, and she helped them adopt a new organizing strategy. The WTUL had been using a kind of academic strategy of doing scholarly studies of conditions and then trying to explain the findings to working women. And Roe Schneiderman said, why don't you take the lead from working women themselves and respond to their requests for aid and organize them based on the things they're interested in changing. So she was able to cultivate the leadership of women workers by putting them in charge of their own strikes instead of the approach that male union leaders wanted her to take of assigning a male leader. And her work with the Women's Trade Union League really helped women who'd been ignored by the male-led union, organize themselves. And that really set the stage for a lot of what was to come in terms of the strikes that came in the years after that. Rose was famous in part for saying that the woman worker wants bread, but she wants roses too. And this idea, this concept of bread and roses, was part of the insight that women brought to unionism, a recognition of women's particular needs, as well as for the traditional demands of higher wages and shorter hours. They were able to articulate needs for time to attend to family and personal issues. They wanted wages that were sufficient not only for eating and having a place to live, but also for money to dress decently and to contribute to their family support, and most of all for education. They wanted opportunities not just to learn about trade union issues, but about the world around them. And Rose was able to fight for some of those things within the ILGWU. She also worked for women's suffrage, and she ran on the Labor Party ticket for U.S. Senate. She did not win, but she was able to highlight issues of importance to working people through that campaign. In her later years, she was very close with the Roosevelts, and she, in fact, was the only woman to serve on FDR's National Recovery Administration Labor Advisory Board and played a key role in shaping some of the landmark legislation of the New Deal. A third partner in their work was Clara Lemlich. She was born in the Ukraine in 1886. She immigrated in 1903. And she began working as a young teen as a seamstress in the Ukraine, and by 16 was working as a dressmaker in New York, where she became active in the ILGWU and began to organize small shops and worked with Schneiderman to do that. And when some of these shops began to go out on strike in the fall of 1909, Clara Lemlich was very prominent on the front lines of this. She was arrested 17 times. She had 6 ribs broken. And she really was encouraging these shops to band together and have a general strike to build on the momentum of these smaller strikes. So when the ILGWU held a big meeting in November to discuss this with all of the bigwigs of the labor movement speaking, many thousands of workers attended, and they were listening to these speakers talk about the terrible conditions, but not really offering any concrete suggestions. And then Clara Lemlich, uninvited, hopped up onto the platform and said, I speak for the women workers, and we demand a general strike. We're tired of just talking about these issues. And her speech really sparked the uprising of the 20,000 shirt makers strike. It was the largest strike of women to that time and to now. And it spread to industrial cities from New York through the Midwest. She was not an unknown person. She was well known when she got up on that stage to call for the strike, but it was still impressive that overnight almost 40,000 women walked off their jobs. Most of them were teenage girls. Most of them were Jewish. And they were able to do this successful grassroots protest because of the 3 years of organizing that these women had been doing. One of the things that was the biggest success of this strike, which lasted for 11 weeks under very difficult conditions, was that it forced male labor leaders to reassess the role of women in the labor movement. It made them realize that they really had the desire and the skill to organize, and they faced very difficult conditions. Bosses tried to divide workers by ethnic group. They hired prostitutes to infiltrate the picket lines. They hired thugs to beat strikers, and then police to arrest the strikers for being disruptive. Women's Trade Union League helped out by sending wealthy women to the strike, to the picket lines, to march with them. They were called the Mink Brigades because they would help restrain the police who didn't want to accidentally club somebody rich, and to gather some press and attention for the strikers. Although the strikers only won a portion of their demands, the uprising really sparked 5 years of revolt that transformed the garment industry into one of the best organized trades in the U.S. They won a 52-hour work week. They won the right to negotiate their wages. They won the right to provision of tools and materials without fee, among other things. And they grew the labor movement considerably. And also very important is that it really affected their own sense of their own power. So they not only convinced the male union leaders that women were organizable and were capable union activists, they also convinced themselves that they had worth, and that power carried them through some of the difficult times to come. One of those things was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. This is sort of the counterpoint to the 1909 strike. Whereas the strike was a kind of example of their power, the power of women workers to make change, the fire represented their failures and the kind of ongoing urgency of their work. In March of 1911, the Triangle Factory fire happened. It claimed the lives of 146 young workers. It was a very preventable and predictable tragedy. The doors of the factory had been locked to keep women from stealing. The fire escapes were not strong enough. The fire engine ladders did not reach to the top floors, and many women jumped from the 8th or 9th stories rather than be burned alive. The fire was on a Saturday in a factory that was very close to Washington Square Park, so there were many people out to witness this very terrible and bloody tragedy. And it really affected a lot of people in New York and affected their sense of the urgency of workers' demands. Also, the Triangle Factory was a very large factory that many people had worked in, so people really knew a lot of the workers and had a sense of personal connection there. I also want to note that the owners of the Triangle Factory were Jewish. They did not change their ways. They collected insurance and reopened within days at a new location with similar kinds of conditions. The trial that in which they were brought resulted in acquittal, and they collected collected their insurance and ultimately had to pay only a very small amount to the families of victims. But one of the positive things to come out of this terrible tragedy was a very effective campaign for factory safety regulation. So for people like Schneiderman and Newman, safety laws became top priority after the fire. They worked to pass labor laws and to create the Factory Investigation Commission, which drafted many laws for the New York State Legislature. And these laws served as models for other states. So not only did it affect workers in New York, but throughout the country. And then, in fact, 20 years later, the New Deal passed federal legislation that was very similar with the aid of many of the same people who had worked to overhaul the New York Labor Code after the Triangle Fire, people like Pauline Newman and Roe Schneiderman. Clara Lemlich, interestingly, after the fire, had been blacklisted from work, and she got married and became an organizer of housewives, doing consumer organizing around issues like food and housing and public education. She joined the Communist Party and was a founder of the United Council of Working Class Housewives, and was really also a lifelong organizer. Even in her 80s, when she lived in the Jewish Home for the Aged in Los Angeles, she helped to organize the orderlies there, and she persuaded the administrators to honor the grape and lettuce boycott that the United Farm Workers were doing at that time. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from these women. We can learn about how the awareness that they had about gender, ethnicity, and class, and how those things work together was a really key piece that undergirded all of their activism. Their fight for education, their knowing the importance of education, which was common to many workers, that they were really thirsty to learn. They sought out night school, which was often disappointing. Sometimes radical politics. In fact, they arrived there because of their desire to have a life of the mind. And unions and the Socialist Party offered many opportunities to study and to learn. And often those discussion groups led to forming unions. So there was a real relationship there between the desire for education and the labor movement. I also just want to mention that it's really important to look at the role of friendship and those kinds of connections and how they influenced activism as well. The relationships, the friendships that were formed on the shop floor were a very important kind of support network for immigrants, helping them build lives in a new land. And so work took on a particular role, a crucial role for them in how they understood who they were and their place in America, and gave them a basis both to make change and to build their own lives. One of the things that Jewish women were able to model was a combination of the kind of trade union organizing skills that they learned on the shop floor with some of the kinds of entrepreneurialism and consumer organizing that they had learned from their mothers, understanding how to combine these kinds of essential roles that women worked in, both as workers in the shops when they were unmarried and as domestic managers within the home when they were running their families. And another insight that Jewish women brought was to have a broad understanding of the different ways of creating change. So not only through unions, but also through legislation, like protective labor laws. This was a period in which the labor movement as a whole was really quite suspicious of government intervention. And Jewish women labor activists really helped to educate the labor movement in the value of legislation, and that became particularly important after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So that's a very brief introduction into Jewish labor activism. There are many other components that we can talk about. The readings, I hope, will give you another little glimpse into different angles of this. I've given you some excerpts from Pauline Newman's unpublished memoir about her experience as a worker and activist, and also a piece from the memoir of a young garment worker in Chicago named Sarah Rosner, as well as a short quote from Roe Schneiderman. And then I also wanted to mix it up and not only give you things to read, but I gave you 2 images, 2 photographs of Jewish labor activists, and 2 songs. I gave you some audio clips of 2 Yiddish worker songs that kind of take very different tones and approaches towards the life of the worker. So I look forward to having the opportunity to discuss these things with you later this week. Thank you very much.